Imagine a world stage meeting between the two most charismatic men of their age. One, a warrior king, unafraid of death, proud of his lion's heart. The other, a philosopher sultan who dreamed not only of victory, but of justice and order. Between them, ruined cities, the cross and the crescent, tens of thousands of corpses, and one prize, Jerusalem. The Third Crusade was more than just battles. It was a clash of mentalities, diplomacy under the shadow of the sword. Perhaps the most famous war in which enemies might have become friends had they lived in another time. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow-burning, deeply researched stories with irony, sources, and respect for the listener. And don't forget to drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's our favorite tradition. It didn't begin with a prayer. It began with fire. In 1187, on the scorched plateau near the Horns of Hattin, the Crusader army, dehydrated, exhausted, encircled, collapsed. This wasn't just a battle. It was the apocalypse of the Latin East. For the first time in nearly 90 years since the First Crusade, Jerusalem stood undefended. Leading the Muslim forces was Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He was no ascetic, but neither just a warlord. In him, piety met icy strategy and flexible statecraft. He united fractured Muslim emirates, ended infighting, and forged a singular force capable of breaking the Crusader order. His opponent was Guy of Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, weak and manipulated by radical barons, especially the notorious Reynald de Chatillon. These radicals violated a truce with Saladin, ambushed a caravan carrying his sister, and effectively signed their own death warrant. Saladin mobilized. In July 1187, he lured the Crusaders into a trap near Hattin. Without water, under a blistering desert sky, the Christian army found itself encircled in a ring of fire. Saladin ordered the grass ignited. Smoke, heat, thirst, and constant harassment shattered the army. Guy was captured. Reynald, personally executed by Saladin for treachery. Jerusalem stood undefended. It was a shock. The Crusader East, built with blood and belief, collapsed in a single day. Saladin was hailed as a liberator. In Europe, the Pope called for a new crusade. And so began one of the most legendary wars of the Middle Ages. But this crusade would not resemble the ones before it, because this time it was the kings who went to war. After Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, the West didn't just tremble, it reeled. This was no longer only about the Holy Land, it was about the authority of Christianity itself. And now, the ones who stepped forward weren't preachers or zealots, but kings. In 1187, Pope Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi, a message as moving as it was severe, calling for vengeance. For the first time in decades, the language of crusade included not just promises of paradise, but tones of political duty. The cross was no longer just salvation, it was statecraft. The first to answer was Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. Already in his 60s, he raised a massive army. Some sources claim up to 100,000 men. He didn't need spiritual visions or papal mandates. He marched not to save souls, but to prove the empire still breathed. Following him came Richard I, the Lionheart, King of England, a warrior from legend, a knight without fear or reproach, but also an ambitious ruler who saw the crusade as a chance to consolidate power and achieve lasting glory. He quickly made peace with France, sold half the royal treasure, taxed the clergy, and set off. Across the Channel was Philip II Augustus, King of France, wise, cold, calculating, not a knight, but a king in the mold of a clerk. He didn't burn for holy war, but he knew if he stayed home, Richard would become the continent's hero. France could not allow that. 3 monarchs, 3 egos. For the first time in crusading history, a war of crowns. And even before they reached the east, it became clear their alliance would be fragile, lasting only as long as the common enemy remained in sight. All 3 sought more than victory over Saladin. Each wanted to command the crusade, to claim authority and land. Jerusalem mattered, yes, but power in Europe mattered more, and Saladin watched. His sultanate had barely digested victory, and already new storms gathered, each wearing a golden crown. The Third Crusade began as a grand logistical campaign. Unlike previous expeditions, this was no unruly mob of zealots. It was disciplined armies, backed by engineering, organization, and crowns. But even kings are not gods, and the road to the Holy Land became a literal trial by fire and water. First to march was Frederick Barbarossa. His route was overland, through Hungary, Byzantium, and Anatolia. This was the oldest strategy, tested during the First Crusade. But times had changed. The Hungarians received the army with caution, the Byzantines with suspicion, the Seljuk Turks with steel. In Anatolia, the Crusaders were harassed by guerrilla bands, found poisoned wells, and saw fields scorched to ash. And though the German army fought valiantly, age does not forgive risk. In June 1190, while crossing the Selef River near Seleucia, Barbarossa drowned. The emperor, who had led tens of thousands, died before even glimpsing the walls of Acre. It wasn't just a loss, it was a decapitation. The German army scattered. Some turned back, some joined other forces, but psychologically, it was a blow to the very spirit of the crusade. Richard and Philip took the sea route, but it was no easier. Richard departed from England via Marseille, paused in Sicily to resolve a dynastic crisis, then headed for Cyprus. And there, his true nature revealed itself. Cyprus was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a rogue Byzantine and self-styled emperor. He detained Richard's ships, looted envoys. In return, Richard conquered the entire island, captured Isaac, chained him in silver, having promised not to use iron, and turned Cyprus into a crusader base. This episode showed that Richard was no mere knight. He was a predator. No hesitation, no negotiations. He acted as both general and diplomat. Philip, meanwhile, arrived in the Holy Land earlier, but quietly. He made little impression, merely waited for the arrival of an ally who would soon become a rival for leadership, not just war. Thus, before any blade clashed, the sea, the rivers, the mountains, and poisoned diplomacy became the Crusade's first battlefield. One king lost, one island gained, and a new conflict drawn, set to unfold in the sands of Palestine. If the Third Crusade was a theater, then Acre was its main stage. It was here, in 1191, that everyone converged: European kings, French barons, Muslim garrisons, and thousands of ordinary soldiers, battered by heat, disease, and despair. The city of Acre, a fortified port on the Palestinian coast, was the vital link between Jerusalem and the sea. The Crusaders had begun its siege back in 1189, without kings, spontaneously and poorly coordinated. But within months, it was clear. Without this city, they could go no further. By 1190, the situation had become a paradox. The Crusaders besieged the city, while Saladin besieged them. A siege within a siege. where both sides starved, sickened, and died. Battles turned into raids and artillery duels. In the summer of 1191, Richard and Philip arrived. Everything changed. The French built siege towers. The English constructed massive stone throwers. Richard, despite fever and gout, personally directed assaults. Meanwhile, tension flared between Richard and Philip. Philip demanded recognition for his favored nobles. Richard insisted that his ally, Guy of Lusignan, be named King of Jerusalem. The dispute over the throne overshadowed the purpose of the crusade. Despite it all, in July 1191, Acre fell. The garrison surrendered. It was the first major crusader victory. And then came the event that would alter the war and Richard's legacy forever. After Acre's surrender, Saladin expected the release of prisoners, as agreed. But negotiations stalled. Richard, losing patience, ordered the execution of over 2,000 Muslim captives. Even by medieval standards, it was a shock. Saladin was forced to respond. No more mercy. The war crossed the line of humanity. The crusade, which began as a matter of faith at Acre, became a matter of vengeance. And no king could withdraw now, because from this point on, it was no longer just a fight for Jerusalem. It had become a personal war between Richard and Saladin. After Acre, the crusade seemed to break free from deadlock. The army moved south along the Palestinian coast, heading toward Jerusalem. But the city remained out of reach, not because of walls, but because of strategy and fear. Richard won a decisive victory at Arsuf in September 1191, one of the few clean crusader victories. It was due to iron discipline, clear commands, and a kind of quasi-Roman tactics. Richard held the army in tight formation under pressure from Mamluk cavalry. When the enemy tired, he personally led the counterattack. Saladin admitted defeat, but was far from broken. He retreated, but didn't collapse, holding strongholds and cutting supply lines. The Crusaders advanced slowly. Every mile cost lives. The landscape wore them down. The heat killed, water turned poisonous, and food spoiled. When the army reached Beit Nuba, just days from Jerusalem, Richard halted and refused to attack. This became a turning point. Some called him a coward, others a strategist. Richard argued the army wasn't prepared for a siege lacking engines, food, and water, and most of all, even if he captured Jerusalem, he could not hold it. Logic prevailed over symbolism, but emotionally, it was a defeat. Soldiers wept. Pilgrims cursed him. The goal of the crusade became a mirage. At the same time, another war raged in the camp. Diplomatic. Richard held secret talks with Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. They discussed a marriage between Al-Adil and Richard's sister, Joan. Under this agreement, Jerusalem would become a neutral kingdom, ruled by a Muslim prince and a Christian queen. Yes, Richard was ready to give up the city in exchange for peace. But neither side was truly prepared for such a compromise, and so back to war. Richard marched on Durham, captured it, then returned to Acre. But the army was exhausted. This was a campaign where war and diplomacy fought side by side, where the sword wasn't always sharper than the word, and where Jerusalem became more than a city. It became a test of reason. By 1191, the Third Crusade was drawing to a close. The army was exhausted, resources drained, and politics on the brink of implosion. Philip the Cent had long since returned home, leaving Richard alone, with Saladin before him and betrayal behind. While Richard fought in Palestine, his brother John Lackland was scheming with Philip. The king who left England for Jerusalem now risked losing both. In June 1192, the Crusaders launched one final march toward Jerusalem. But again, they halted beneath its walls. There was no siege. Everyone knew this was the end. And then, in a final Roman-style move, Richard struck again. He captured Jaffa, a vital port, and held it against a surprise counterattack from Saladin. His personal bravery, fighting barefoot without a helmet, sword in hand, became legend. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat. It was the gesture of a king who had nothing left to lose. After the battle, negotiations. In September 1192, they signed a truce. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were granted safe passage. The coastal strip would remain in Crusader hands. The war put on pause. Richard never entered Jerusalem. He looked at it from a distance, from a hilltop, helmet still on. The pilgrimage never completed. His journey home was humiliating. Captured in Austria, he spent a year imprisoned. When he returned, he was hailed a legend, but he never became king of Jerusalem. Saladin died a year later. In his treasury were only a few coins. He had given everything to war and to charity. He earned glory, not riches. So ended the Third Crusade. No final triumph, no reclaimed holy city. Only the shadows of two giants. A king who fought like a lion but did not win, and a sultan who won but with honor. Friends, if you've listened this far, you are true pilgrims of history. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your trust. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy deep stories where swords clash with diplomacy, and kings fight not only for cities, but for legacy. And please, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. We're truly curious how far the echoes of the Crusades have reached